I guess, I don't know, right? We don't have a particular agenda. The theme here is just really talking about ZKPs, FHE, MPC. I think the design space, with all of them, there's this kind of often, I don't know, characteristic, antagonistic position that people take, and I think it's, we're just going to have a pretty open discussion about what problems each of these different things are good for, like their tools, and how should we kind of best apply the tools, what are the trade-offs, all this kind of stuff. So maybe we can jump in, just do a quick intro to start with, and then kick off the discussion from there. So, okay, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah. I'm Mikerah. I run Hashlook in Spot Labs. Hashlook is a cryptography consulting firm. Louder.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay. Hashlook is a cryptography consulting R&D company. We help clients integrate cryptography into their stacks safely, securely. And recently we spun out Software Labs, which is an MPC and software company. We're mainly focused on making it very easy for devs to integrate MPC into their apps without needing to be cryptographers. Yeah, that's it.
Mikerah is very smart. I'm Quintus. I work on, I'm a Flashbots. I've worked on many like sort of cryptoeconomic design problems before, and then in doing that, I've realized TEEs are very valuable and probably going to be around for a while. And so in the last year and a half, I've dedicated my time to first researching and now sort of trying to realize better secure hardware. And so I guess I'm on the, I don't think there needs to be camped, but I'm on the secure hardware camp here. I would want to inject maybe one reframing of the question, which is that people often talk about these different technologies, but we won't be clear about the timeline. So we'll say like, you should never use TEEs because insecure. Never use FHE; it's too slow. But then we're not making a fair comparison. Right? We say FHE is much more secure. We don't acknowledge that the performance we're talking about is 5 or 10 years in the future. So we can either talk about applications today or applications of tomorrow, and obviously those are linked together. But I think that's maybe a useful distinction to make.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wholeheartedly agree there. It's super common for people to make these apples to oranges comparisons on timelines or on technologies because they're not conscious of what is currently theory, what is currently practical, and what's I don't know in the kind of middle ground of kind of what the trajectory between those two states is. Common problem. I wholeheartedly agree. I guess for everyone else here, like this is pretty unstructured, and so I'd like to make it as much of a discussion as possible. If anyone has opinions or ideas or questions, then feel free to jump in. I think to start with, maybe would be great to get a feel for. Topically here, the current, given the current state of the TEEs of MPC and FHE and ZKPs, what at an abstract level or at a relatively high level, what are the types of problems that you think that these different technologies are suitable for solving today?
Yeah, we're still trying to figure this out, but broadly speaking, there's like an overlap across all of these technologies and what problems they can solve today. The main question, I think, is mainly like, less technical and more like human-based. Like, what are the resources to like get this done? Is it easy to like learn? Is it easy to upskill? That being said, a lot of the applications where like you want to use TEEs, MPC, FHE tend to be the same, like auctions, dark pools, any sort of like federated learning, anywhere where like you have a requirement on the data, and that data needs to be like only held by like a person or by a set of parties that are known ahead of time, and then you need to operate on that data in like a secure, distributed way, whilst sort of keeping the guarantees of how we sort of build microservices today. And so yeah, if your problems that you're trying to solve sort of fit into this like dilemma of who holds data, what do they need to do with it, then usually using any of these primitives like are helpful. And then at that point, it's merely a matter of like, what kind of resources do you have? What are your constraints that are imposed by the product that you're building? And that usually narrows down exactly which one of these that you want to use.
I thought Jens Groff did a really nice explanation yesterday at the Frontier Forum where he spoke about proofs of commission and proofs of omission, where snarks allow you to say, that you did something correctly or that there's some pattern that's true about some data that you hold without necessarily revealing that data. But then once you want to prove that some data wasn't used for a certain purpose, then we move into the world of MPC and by extension FHE and TEEs. And so I think that ZK, the only reason you wouldn't use it if you could is purely because it doesn't apply or because it's currently not efficient enough. For the sort of the MPC world or the privacy world, and here I think both of you guys know more about me on the crypto side, but there I think there's like two dimensions to the argument. One is performance, like with the ZK side, where I come from the MED world. They were learning these big optimization functions or programs that are very latency sensitive. You can't put that in any of the existing MPC implementations. But at the same time, even when you do have MPC, you have to reason about collusion attacks and early decryption and these kinds of things. And so if you look at most MPC deployments today, they're also using TEEs to protect against collusive attacks. So I think those are probably the two relevant things to compare.
Yeah, absolutely. So a useful way that I've found to frame this, I was just talking with Mikerah about, is as a trilemma. So you have three properties in aggregation, verifiability, and confidentiality. And you can essentially pick two of those three properties and must make a compromise on the third, which is a kind of fundamental problem. And so the choice for which technologies or which combination of technologies is really about which compromise, which trade-off they pop to the roof. If the trade-off is on verifiability, then I say maybe another way to put this is a good example, say, of turning off verifiability would be a paper secret ballot, right? Your typical way of doing voting. You write your vote on a piece of paper, drop it in a box, and shake the box. And so you get with confidentiality, you get the aggregation of votes at the expense of verifiability. Another example of a trade-off here would be say like Zcash or Railgun, where we're trading off the capacity to aggregate. You can kind of put things into the system and take things out. We don't have any concept of shared secret state, and so we're going to get to have full verifiability, full confidentiality at the expense of aggregation. And then on that kind of bottom side of that triangle, where we've got aggregation and verifiability, you think about things like a public blockchain like Ethereum, where we're explicitly trading off confidentiality entirely for the sake of verifiable aggregation. And where these technologies I think come in is allowing you to get all three to some extent, but having a better set of trade-offs on that third property. Let's say MPC or FO2.
So actually, one thing that we all should maybe question is, you said that they're trading off privacy entirely, and in some sense that's true. But so even in this like public ledger, whatever public state setting, there are still ways in which you can achieve something that resembles privacy with like stealth addresses and pseudonymity, and with smart accounts where you can maybe share an account and then use snarks to be able to move funds around. I mean, people have built what Railgun on Ethereum, right? So it's a bit more complicated. And if you look at maybe an interesting thing to point at is this is not a complete system, but it's an interesting idea. if you look at how Tor works or how like some of the order flow auctions in the MPP supply chain works, you try to hide some information. You don't want to do the overhead of doing MPC competition or whatever. So they just, in the Tor case, they don't inject noise, but they have multiple users and try to hide the user within that. In the like Mev Blocker, Mev Share in Ethereum case, or Mev Blocker is a good example, they just inject a bunch of noise. And they rely on the adversary not being able to distinguish between what's real and what's fake. And we don't talk about that necessarily in these discussions so much, but it's a useful technique.
Right, yeah, like I think that's more in the realm of like differential privacy that is like heavily applied in Web 2, where you care about like the individual level information that's being emitted and not just like the group level, because like we don't talk about this enough in crypto, I think, but you know, MPC, FHA, like all these like three-letter acronyms, they give you like, they still give you like the exact like, you know, individual level computation, right? It doesn't like hide you within a crowd necessarily. And that's where like stuff like differential privacy is like heavily deployed in practice, because people do care about like the individual level privacy, but they still want to get utility out of the things that they built. And like if you look into differential privacy, there's things like the privacy utility trade-off. If you add too much noise, you don't get much utility. If you add too little, you get no privacy. So like, you know, these trade-offs appear even with like, you know, location services and things that you use in day-to-day that are not crypto specific. And so yeah, it'd be good if we can like bring a little bit of that into like on-chain crypto and not just like off-chain, like in the case of like MEV options and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. You want to go? Okay, so I would love to. I asked a question to Jordi on stage at the Frontier Forum about hardware. So one of the ways that I've thought at least about hardware guarantees versus cryptographic but economic guarantees was the kind of direction that trust is flowing. I think one of the hang-ups that I have with TEEs as the kind of cornerstone for decentralized protocols is my capacity or kind of lack thereof to verify that the TEE is instantiated as expected, right? That it does what it says it does, and particularly to be able to do that remotely. Right? I think that the guarantees of this currently are rooted in supply chain or manufacture chain attestations. That's kind of suboptimal, and I know in future there's the idea of kind of verifiable hardware, but it's still it's not clear to me as a remote user that never gets physical access to the device what verification of that would look like.
I think that you know, absent some very big breakthroughs in more like insider cryptography, we're in a position where the best we can do is to have a sort of threshold honesty assumption. For some use cases, some you can avoid that completely, like we're speaking about snarks. But if you look at MPC protocols today, you assume at least whatever 1 out of n nodes is honest, or you know, it depends how you parameterize it. Usually it's like 2/3 to something like that. And in the hardware case, I completely agree. Today, you have to like rely on Intel or whoever it is. And you can think of these TEs as like a little bit more that basically just an extension of their like the behavior of the big corporations that have a big reputation at stake. But that isn't fundamental to the technology. And to give you like a third experiment to make the point, imagine you have some 100% guaranteed methodology, given physical access to a chip, you can verify that it satisfies some design. That's yet trivial, but imagine that exists. And we leave aside like logistical issues. Now we take n verifiers. It could be the same people you want to run your MPC nodes, and have each of them inspect a chip which has its own cryptographic identity, and they sign a signature saying, I looked at this chip with identity private key or public key this, and it looks good to me, and they post it on a blockchain. Then from a user's perspective, we're looking at this and say, okay, well, that's, you know, whatever trust assumptions you're making to the MPC, you trust what, in the case where everyone looks at it, you trust 1 out of n, maybe you subsample, you trust a threshold or something like that. Then, you know, you have this like threshold obviously assumption, and it's, you know, it's hard to reach, but it's comparable to the cryptography setting. Maybe the other thing to add in here is that one difference between the hardware world and cryptography is that hardware is that concrete costs, right? In order to manufacture a second photo mask to resemble the original photo mask of a chip, like the original, like the thing that the fab produces, costs tens of millions of dollars depending on like what technology you use. And so if there's a chance of being caught, you can like do the equation and say, okay, look, from a rational perspective, how much reward does there need to be for a rational adversary to attack the system and expend that much money? And there's reputational questions, those different kinds of things. So I don't think it's a lost cause at all, to summarize a very long answer.
I mean, also, like, Frank, I love the trade-offs that you make with TEEs. They look similar to what you'd make in, like, other kinds of software anyway. I think in crypto, we just, like, shine a light on it and, like, emphasize, like, hey, maybe we should reconsider, and critically look at, these assumptions that we make on software in general, right? And, sometimes I think some people, like, overdo it. And in other cases, it's sort of like, yeah, this is actually, like, critical because right now we just trust Intel or whoever to, like, manufacture these chips. And whenever we all try to learn a bit more about it, it's like, really hard to, like, discern what's going on. And you go through, like, years of blocks. Some of it is not public. And so it does, like, shine a light on, okay, we do need to, like, improve the state of TEs because in practice, it gives us a lot of properties that you can't just get along with cryptography. Even when you compose it with cryptography, it gives us, like, a much better trade-off side than not having it, right? Like, you can enforce things in the physical world, try to enforce things in the visual world, or just through software. And so, yeah, like, I think TEs are, like, pretty nascent in how we're sort of reasoning about them and trying to use them. And we shouldn't just throw out the baby with the bathwater. We should really, like, continue, like, being critical about them and try to improve how we can use them because they do offer a lot of practical solutions today for a lot of problems that we have today.
Yeah.
I feel like this is as I expected, where it's like TEs. It's like this is kind of how I expected, where it's like TEs versus like kind of the others, which I like. But maybe like, what if we take TEs out of the equation for a second and like maybe kind of compare the other options like on their merits, and that way.
Well, yeah, for sure.
So just a comment about that. I think so. If you follow me on Twitter, I'm at Bad Crypto Rich. Maybe like you've seen my memes, and like for a while, like they kind of like make fun of like whatever the current zeitgeist is in cryptography or whatever. And for a while, I was making like a lot of TE memes, like saying like they're pretty good. And so like I hope that in some of these memes, you kind of, if you followed them when I was making them, that like you can't really separate cryptography and TEs like in practice and in practice because like we do need them. And you can't just like deploy a lot of this like cryptography safely without taking into account like collusion risk happens. Like sure we say collusion and we mean like all of some like big bad scary man is like coming for your node. But like in practice collusion is literally just some dev like deployed something on the same machine and like was like, oh, I'm just like testing it out, and I kept on using it to put it in something in production. I didn't realize like, hey, I deployed this thing on the same machine. And like in practice, that's what collusion risk looks like, right? It's like usually something that's like human level. It's not really malicious necessarily, and so like whenever we try and make a separation between like TEs, MPC or FPG, whatever, like it doesn't really hold in practice because in practice, if you do want to deploy this stuff securely, you do have to make a conscious decision of like using TEs, knowing how to deploy entities, and then there's like a whole process and a bunch of tooling for the TEs that you need to be mindful of in order to like maintain the guarantees that like these cryptographic protocols give you, right? So like the example of collusion that Quintus gave earlier on, that's enforced in practice via the use of TEs. And so like if you want to have that assumption, like you can't just like deploy MPC without it. Otherwise it kind of breaks down. So yeah, I get like we want to move on from talking solely about TEs, but in practice it's very important to like mention that they're kind of necessary.
Also, it's just a super interesting rabbit hole to dive down. I do really like this idea of effectively what you described there was similar to a trusted setup ceremony, right? So you think about like the KZG trusted setup ceremony where you have a whole bunch of people come in and sequence and contribute noise to ultimately produce the trusted setup. And you have this one event trust assumption. And my strategy for trusting any of these trusted setup ceremonies is just to go and participate in it myself. Right? And so there's this interesting parallel here, like in a digital setting for a ZK trusted setup ceremony. The logistics of that, the coordination is viable because you can do it remotely. I'm trying to imagine the same thing in a hardware scenario, right? Do we parade around this TE at a conference like this and get everyone to come and kind of verify it independently? Actually, I think that would be a really cool thing to do. It would be a neat way to like build up that kind of attestation chamber. Again, if we can trust one out of those N people, and ideally if one of those people can be you, then we can have some much better trust in any system kind of dependent on that device then.
Yeah, I think the analogy makes sense, and I agree that it is harder in a physical world to do these kind of verifications. But maybe one interesting point to make there is that the cost is paid up front, and once you have done the verification, then you can sort of send it off into the world, and as you're doing the computation, you don't need to do any communication with other nodes to verify that the chip is doing what it's doing, as long as the actual design is secure, right? And in the MPC case, you have to do a lot of communication, at least so you decrypt if you're using FHE, and otherwise much more. And then maybe a question for you guys. So, if we imagine a world where we have very performant MPC and these kinds of things, NPC, and we want to have a very decentralized, secure system. Our solution today has been to have many parties involved, and people talk about the layer or node operator set and these kind of things, but it seems much harder to do in the MPC setting because the more people you have, the less knowledge you have what's going on. It feels more complicated because maybe the technical distinction is that in the blockchain setting, you can tell when some nodes have misbehaved and double signed. That in the MPC setting, you can't tell if someone has some nodes have colluded to decrypt or sign something they shouldn't have. Decrypting the main concern. So how do you deal with that?
Use TEEs.
Okay, well,
that was the move.
That alone isn't an answer, right? No, you can't have everyone running Intel T2XSR. You want some diversity.
Yeah, but like the reality of, like, this is like, physics composed, right? Like the reality of having to move tuition means that like you have to make some trade-off on like where the nodes are in the world, what hardware they're running, right? Like you can't, like Ethereum is like the best case, or like Bitcoin and Ethereum like the best cases where like we just make an assumption that they're running wherever they're on the world and like they still work. But as a result, the trade-off is that they're very slow. And, at the protocol level, they make assumptions that like they don't trust you by default, right? And as a result, they're quite slow. But once you have like a credible neutral layer on top, like you can build applications on top where you can like play with this trade-off space, right? And so like on the application layer, you don't need tens of thousands of nodes running your software. Maybe you just need like 100. Maybe you just need 10, depending on like what you're running. So, like, in theory, sure, you don't want just anybody running your MPC nodes, but in practice, like you're physically imposed by like your application and like what people are using it for, and that gives you the space to be able to be like, okay, I can assume that like 10 people have access to a TE. They have these hardware guarantees and access to these hardware resources, and I want them to run this specific program. And that's okay because we are building on top of a incredibly neutral layer, and that layer can show that like if we're being, sketchy in some way, then he catch us, and we're kind of like held not only by replications but by cryptoeconomics as well.
So an alternate approach to this, rather than secure the MPC with a TE, an alternate strategy that's been proposed is actually to make the MPC protocol hardened against being run in a TE, right? Because the protocol being able to be executed inside of a TE is part of what enables collusion.
this is an interesting problem there because it opens up this arms race. Right? We can make it hard to today's TEEs, but tomorrow's TEEs will change their capacity, right? Will improve in their capacity. And so you end up with this interesting kind of the one there where the protocol has an arms race with hardware manufacturers.
Yeah, so to make what you're saying concrete, you're saying make running an MPC node require effectively having something like a Bitcoin miner. Like you have to have specialized hardware to do it.
No. Not that it requires specialized hardware. You make the aggregative portion of the MPC protocol, right? The portion where you combine the shares, you make that hard to run inside of a TEE. What I mean by that is so TEEs, for example, have generally a really small memory. We'll have like low bandwidth.
That's the older generations.
It's an arms race because you have obviously TEEs evolving rapidly to serve different needs. But so this is the kind of one of the theoretical ways of dealing with this class of problem. It's to make it the algorithm TEE hard.
I think that if you are not willing to go for specialized hardware to accomplish what you're advocating for, you will not succeed in making a TEE hard because the computation needs to be doable in MPC, right? The threshold.
The MPC itself. Computation needs to be done. It needs to be done.
Yeah. Sure. Okay, sorry. Let me rephrase what I was saying.
It's arbitraging the difference between computing on regular hardware versus computing on a TEE.
Yeah, and the point that I'm making is that the delta between regular hardware and TEEs is quite small. And maybe if we make them much more secure, there's like sources of overhead that will make it very different. But I think that this is sort of a concrete measure that's very dangerous to play with, and it seems like we don't. I think the only way you could really make this argument is if you had ASICs for your MPC computation that people didn't have TEEs for, and then yes, you're this arms race, but now you're already producing ASICs for your MPC, and I wonder if it would be better just to make them like secure ASICs as well. Then you're back to TEEs for special purpose MPC, or especially designed for MPC.
Yeah, I think we need to wrap.
I just want to plug one thing, and then I'll stop talking for the rest of the panel, which is we have all of these discussions about secure hardware in the context of privacy. We talk about TE and MPC and the interactions and how they're different or substitutable. But secure hardware is interesting for a lot of other things. Like you get these cameras now that when they take a photo will have a chip that signs the photo, the file, so that we can distinguish more easily between generated deepfakes and actual images. Or if you have a surveillance camera somewhere, or your self-driving car, you want to know what's happening inside the brain of this thing. Is the surveillance camera sending the data off to the NSA, or is the car you're driving like running the correct safety protocols or something like that? So it goes way beyond just this privacy discussion, but I think it's important. The privacy aspect is very important. So
actually, that's a good point. Like TEEs, in this space, they could think of them as a privacy solution, but there's this other angle, which like they're very useful for integrity, which is like the use cases you mentioned. And so like instead of like getting MPC, MPC versus TEEs, we should be thinking about like, okay, MPC, MPC are good for confidentiality, but not so great for integrity, because like if we add integrity, it's just less efficient basically. And this is where TEEs come in as a decent integrity solution for enhancing the cryptographic solutions that we're interested in deploying in Batnos. So yeah, I guess last words. Don't separate MPC and MPC from TEEs. They're quite complementary, and you got to be deploying both in practice.
Don't be maxis. Go. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.